What if your reality isn't the only one? In the mirror's shadow, Sarah discovers a parallel world where the familiar twists into a nightmare. Trapped in a realm where reflections come alive and the line between reality and illusion blurs, escape seems impossible. But the real question is, can she trust what she sees, or even herself? Sarah returned home after another exhausting day at work. Normally, her small house welcomed her with its comforting warmth, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, and the eager greeting of her cat, Muzzy. But tonight, everything felt wrong. The air inside was heavy, thick, as though she had stepped into a sealed vacuum. The usual inviting atmosphere was replaced by an eerie stillness. "Muzzy!" Sarah called, setting her bag on the counter. Her voice echoed faintly, the sound distorted in the unsettling quiet. No response. She flipped on the lights. The house illuminated as expected, but something was off. The furniture wasn't where she had left it. The kitchen table was pushed closer to the window, and the hallway mirror, which had always hung perfectly straight, now tilted at an unsettling angle. Sarah frowned, shaking her head. "I'm just tired," she muttered to herself. But the unease followed her as she moved through the house. When she stepped into her bedroom, Sarah froze. The room was entirely different. Her bed, her nightstand, her belongings, everything was gone. In their place stood dusty antique furniture that seemed out of another era. The wardrobe loomed large and imposing, its dark wood gleaming faintly. An old vanity table sat against the wall, its mirror cracked and clouded with age. The walls were adorned with faded photographs. They were unsettling, family portraits perhaps, but the faces were indistinct, blurred as though someone had tried to erase them. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, backing out of the room. She reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. She yanked harder, her breath quickening as the panic began to rise. The metal doorknob was icy cold against her skin, as though it had been left out in freezing air. Then she heard it, a faint scratching noise. It was soft at first, almost like the sound of a branch scraping against a window. But it was coming from the other side of the door. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest as she pressed her ear against the wood. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging slowly along the surface. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The scratching stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then came the whispering. It was low, guttural, almost too quiet to understand. The words didn't make sense, a string of sounds that felt more like a threat than a language. "Who's there?" Sarah demanded, her voice breaking. The whispering stopped, replaced by the faint creak of floorboards shifting behind the door. Sarah stumbled back, her legs hitting the dresser. She knocked over a small trinket, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound startled her, and she glanced down. It was a snow globe, one she didn't recognize. Inside was a tiny figure of a woman, standing in front of a house that looked eerily like hers. The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, the photographs on the walls were different. The blurred faces were gone. Now, every photograph showed a single image, her own face. In each picture, Sarah stared out with hollow black eyes. Her expression was blank, her mouth twisted into a faint, unnerving smile. The whispering returned, louder now, almost inside her head. It echoed through the room, an oppressive force that seemed to press against her skull. The dresser behind her creaked, its drawers sliding open on their own. A faint chill crept over her shoulder, like breath against her neck. Sarah turned around slowly, the blood draining from her face. The cracked mirror on the vanity reflected the room behind her, but not her. In the glass stood a figure, tall and shadowy, its face obscure. Its hand rested on her shoulder, its fingers long and skeletal. Sarah screamed, spinning around, but the room was empty. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and suffocating. Then the scratching began again, louder and more frantic. It came from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the door, as though something was desperately trying to claw its way in. Sarah backed into the corner, her breathing ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she heard it, a low, rasping voice, clear and deliberate, coming from the other side of the room. "You're home now. You can't leave." Sarah stood paralyzed, her pulse thundering in her ears. The photographs on the walls, all of them bearing her distorted, hollow-eyed image, seemed to leer at her. The scratching at the door intensified, each drag of claws against wood more frantic, more desperate. Her grip on the heavy candlestick tightened, the cold metal biting into her palm. She crept toward the door, her footsteps muffled on the old rug. As she pressed her ear against the wood, the whispers began again. "Sarah, come out." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice wasn't unfamiliar this time. It was hers. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug. The candlestick clattered to the floor as she landed hard on her hands. Her eyes darted toward the mirror on the dresser, the cracked glass glinting in the dim light. Her reflection didn't mimic her movements. It stood perfectly still, its eyes fixed on her. Slowly, its mouth twisted into a wide, unnerving grin. "Let me out," it whispered. Sarah froze as the reflection lifted its hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass. The surface rippled like liquid, faint distortions spreading outward as though the barrier between them had begun to dissolve. "No," Sarah whispered, barely able to speak. Her voice was shaky, her throat dry. The reflection's smile stretched wider, unnaturally so, its teeth sharp and glinting. "You're already in," it said, its tone mockingly sweet. The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah's breaths came in short, panicked gasps as the chill deepened, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. The faint scent of mildew filled her nostrils, sharp and damp, undercut by a metallic tang that turned her stomach. When the lights flickered back on, the room had changed. The antique furniture was gone, replaced by cold, bare concrete walls. The rug beneath her was gone, and the floor was rough, unfinished stone. The door was no longer there. In its place stood a single tall mirror, its ornate gilded frame a chilling replica of the one on the dresser. From within the mirror, her reflection stepped forward. It wasn't a perfect copy. Its movements were jerky, as though it were unused to the motion of its limbs. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its grin never faltered. The reflection's eyes were void-like, their emptiness pulling at Sarah like a magnet. Sarah scrambled back, her hands scraping against the rough floor. The reflection's steps were silent as it moved closer, one hand still resting on the rippling surface of the glass. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice a distorted echo of Sarah's own. "But you came anyway." "I didn't," Sarah stammered, shaking her head. The reflection crouched down, mimicking her position. Its movements were fluid now, too smooth, as if it had grown comfortable in its stolen form. "Don't you see?" it hissed, leaning closer. Its grin widened to an impossible extent, stretching past the edges of its face. "This is your home now." Sarah's hands searched frantically for anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers brushed against the candlestick, and she gripped it tightly. With a scream, she swung it at the mirror. The reflection's grin disappeared, replaced by a look of pure fury. The candlestick struck the glass with a deafening crack, spiderweb fractures spreading across its surface. But the mirror didn't shatter. Instead, the cracks began to bleed. Thick, dark rivulets of blood seeped from the fractured glass, pooling onto the floor. The reflection hissed, its features warping as though the cracks had affected it too. its grin twisted into something grotesque, its eyes narrowing into slits. "You can't break it," it snarled. "You can only make it worse." The mirror began to hum, a low vibration that resonated in Sarah's chest. The cracks in the glass glowed faintly, the blood bubbling as if the mirror itself were alive. The reflection reached through the glass, its hand extending unnaturally far. The skin on its fingers peeled back, revealing claw-like tips as it grasped for Sarah. Desperation surged through her. She swung the candlestick again and again, each strike sending vibrations through the air. The mirror seemed to absorb the blows, its surface rippling and bending, but never breaking. The room began to warp around her. The concrete walls twisted and folded, the floor tilting as though gravity itself had turned against her. The reflection's voice rang in her ears, louder now, almost deafening. "You can't leave! You are mine!" The hand was inches from her face when Sarah acted on instinct. She dropped the candlestick and reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. The flashlight. She switched it on, aiming the beam directly at the reflection. The light hit the mirror, and the reflection shrieked, recoiling as though burned. Its form writhed, dissolving into smoke that coiled back into the fractured glass. The room went still. The blood on the floor vanished, and the cracks in the mirror sealed themselves with a sickening sound, like bones snapping into place. The door reappeared, its frame old and splintered, but no longer locked. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stumbled to her feet, her legs shaking, and ran for the door. She wrenched it open and burst into the hallway, slamming it shut behind her. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cold night air stinging her lungs. Her house loomed behind her, dark and silent, its windows blank like empty eyes. In her trembling hand, she still held the phone, the flashlight beam casting faint shadows on the ground. As Sarah turned to leave, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft tapping coming from the bedroom window. She didn't look back. The figure standing before Sarah looked identical to her, yet utterly alien. Its void-like eyes absorbed the dim light of the room, and its smile stretched unnaturally wide, revealing teeth too sharp, too perfect. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling as she gripped the candlestick like a lifeline. The reflection tilted its head, its movements fluid yet unnervingly mechanical. "I'm you," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "The better you." "That's not possible," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding as she inched backward. "Oh, but it is," the reflection replied, its smile widening. It began to circle her, each step deliberate, predatory. "This is my world. You don't belong here." "What do you want?" Sarah choked out, her grip tightening on the candlestick until her knuckles turned white. The reflection stopped, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "I want to trade places." Before Sarah could process the words, the room began to shift violently. The walls shuddered, then melted away into inky darkness, leaving her suspended in a void. A bone-chilling wind howled around her, pulling at her hair and clothes, and the air grew dense with the metallic tang of blood. The mirror loomed larger, its surface shimmering like liquid silver, rippling with an unnatural rhythm. A force dragged at Sarah's feet, pulling her closer to the glistening mirror. "No!" she screamed, planting her feet and swinging the candlestick with all her strength at the reflection. The impact shattered the figure into shards of shadow. But instead of falling, the pieces dissolved into a thick, black mist. The mist swirled around her, closing in like a living entity. It pressed against her skin, cold and suffocating, probing, trying to seep into her body. She gasped as an overwhelming sense of dread clawed at her mind, the mist whispering in her own voice. "Let me in, Sarah. Let me in." Fighting the pull, Sarah turned and ran blindly into the void. But no matter which direction she chose, the mirror was always there, standing impossibly close, its surface rippling in anticipation. "You can't escape," the reflection's voice called out, disembodied yet omnipresent. You belong to me now." Sarah screamed, her breath hitching as the mist coiled tighter around her, forcing her steps to falter. The ground beneath her feet became slippery, as if coated in oil. She stumbled and fell, the candlestick slipping from her grasp and vanishing into the blackness. Desperation surged through her veins. She clawed at the ground, but it offered no purchase. The mirror inched closer, pulling her toward its glistening surface like a predator to its prey. "Let me go," Sarah cried, her voice hoarse. "You're mine," the reflection whispered, its tone cold and final. The mist tightened its grip, and Sarah felt herself being lifted off the ground, drawn toward the mirror. The silver surface shimmered, revealing an image of herself, normal, calm, standing in her bedroom as though nothing had happened. Her doppelganger turned, locking eyes with her through the glass. "Go ahead," it said with a smirk. "See how it feels to watch." The mist pushed Sarah forward, and she collided with the mirror. The surface rippled like water, engulfing her in a freezing embrace. She tried to scream, but the cold stole the breath from her lungs. Her surroundings shifted again, and suddenly she was staring out from inside the mirror. The bedroom materialized around her, but it was warped, as though viewed through a warped pane of glass. She pounded on the surface, her fists striking the inside of the mirror, but it didn't budge. "Let me out!" she screamed, but no sound came. On the other side, her doppelganger stood where she had been, stretching its limbs as though settling into a new body. It turned to face the mirror, its black eyes gleaming with triumph. "Don't worry," it said, its voice perfectly mimicking hers. "I'll take care of everything. I'll be the Sarah you never could." "No!" Sarah screamed again, slamming her fists against the glass, but her reflection only smiled before turning away, leaving her trapped in the void. The bedroom began to fade, replaced by endless darkness. The mist seeped into the mirror, wrapping around Sarah like chains, binding her in place. The whispers started again, a chorus of voices overlapping, mocking, condemning. "You're here now," they said. "You'll always be here." Sarah's hands trembled as she realized the truth. The mirror wasn't just a reflection, it was a prison, and she was its newest inmate. Sarah's breath hitched as she stumbled through the endless void, her legs heavy, her mind consumed by fear. The mirror was always there, just a few steps ahead, shimmering like liquid silver, teasing her with its presence. She screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate, but the sound dissolved into the suffocating silence. The mist swirled around her, dark tendrils clawing at her heels, pulling her back toward the mirror's pull. Then she saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. Hope surged in her chest, fragile but undeniable. She forced her legs to move, sprinting toward the light with everything she had. The mist seemed to resist, wrapping tighter around her ankles, dragging her down with every step. "Let me go!" she screamed, fighting harder. The light grew brighter, taking shape. It was a door, simple and wooden, its edges glowing faintly against the darkness. Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling as she grasped the handle. The mist clawed at her, its whispers turning frantic and angry, but she twisted the knob and flung the door open. She fell through, her knees hitting solid ground. When Sarah looked up, her breath caught in her throat. She was back in her living room. The warm glow of the lamps bathed the space in comforting light. The familiar scent of lavender from her diffuser filled the air, and the hum of the refrigerator buzzed faintly in the background. "Muzzy?" Sarah called, her voice shaking. Her black and white cat darted into the room, tail held high. He purred loudly as he weaved between her legs, his fur soft and real against her trembling hands. Tears welled in her eyes as relief flooded her. She scooped Muzzy up, hugging him close. "I'm home," she whispered. "I'm safe." But the moment didn't last. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The mirror in the hallway. It was tilted, just as it had been before this nightmare began. She froze, her arms tightening around Muzzy as dread crept into her chest. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers. The figure standing within the glass was identical to her, but entirely wrong. Its eyes were hollow voids, and its smile stretched unnaturally wide. Sarah's knees went weak as her reflection raised a hand, pressing its palm against the inside of the glass. The surface rippled like water under its touch. A hand that wasn't hers. "Muzzy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The cat hissed and squirmed out of her grasp, darting into the shadows. The reflection tilted its head, its smile widening. "Don't," Sarah began, stepping back. From behind her, a voice whispered, soft and cold, "You didn't make it out." Sarah's body stiffened, her blood turning to ice. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the emptiness of her home. The warmth she had felt moments ago was gone, replaced by a chill that seeped into her bones. The mirror's surface began to glow faintly, its edges shimmering like molten silver. In the glass, her reflection stepped back, making way for something else. The mist poured through the cracks in the mirror, pooling on the hardwood floor like a living shadow. It writhed and twisted, forming shapes, limbs, claws, faces that flickered in and out of existence. "No," Sarah whispered, stumbling backward. Her heel caught on the edge of the rug, and she fell, her palms scraping against the floor. The mist crept closer, the whispers growing louder, overlapping in a cacophony of taunts and promises. "You're home now," one voice said. "You belong to us," hissed another. "This is where you stay," they chorused. The mist reached her, cold tendrils wrapping around her wrists and ankles, pulling her toward the mirror. She clawed at the floor, but it was no use. Her reflection watched, its grin never faltering. "You thought you escaped," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "But you've been here all along." The mist lifted her off the ground, dragging her closer to the mirror. The surface rippled violently, an open maw ready to consume her. Sarah screamed, thrashing against the pull, but the mist was too strong. Her reflection leaned closer, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "Let me take care of everything," it whispered. "It's my turn now." The last thing Sarah saw was the glass shattering outward, shards of light and darkness enveloping her as the mist pulled her through. And then, silence. In the hallway, the mirror stood straight once more, its surface smooth and undisturbed. Inside the glass, Sarah's reflection remained. It smiled faintly, raising a hand to the inside of the mirror as if to wave. In the living room, Muzzy purred softly, curling up on the rug. Outside, the house stood quiet, unassuming, a cozy haven hiding the secrets within. And the hallway mirror waited,